Calcutta, November 1857. The monsoon has passed, leaving the streets slick with mud and the air heavy with the scent of decay. In the shadow of Fort William, where the Union Jack hangs motionless in the humid stillness, a young British officer stands at his desk, candle flame flickering across a leather-bound ledger. His pen scratches methodically across the page, recording revenues collected from villages he will never visit, from people whose language he will never speak. Outside, the Hooghly River flows dark and silent, carrying with it the commerce of an empire built on an impossible mathematics. 200 men governing 200 million souls. The numbers defy logic, yet the ledgers do not lie. Somewhere in the mathematics of empire, between the columns of taxation and the margins of military deployment, lies a story not of conquest alone, but of something far more intricate, a machinery of control so subtle, so psychologically penetrating, that it would function with almost supernatural efficiency for nearly 2 centuries. This is not a tale of battles alone, though battles there were, nor is it simply a chronicle of exploitation, though the exploitation was systematic and vast. This is the anatomy of dominion, a study in how power, when properly engineered, requires surprisingly few hands to operate its levers. The British conquest of India was not achieved through overwhelming numbers, but through an alchemy of divide and rule, through the careful manipulation of existing hierarchies, through the transformation of India's own institutions into instruments of subjugation. It was a conquest of the mind as much as the land, a reimagining of reality itself until millions came to accept the rule of thousands as something approaching the natural order of things. The foundation of this impossible empire was laid long before that officer bent over his ledger in Calcutta. It began not with soldiers, but with merchants, not with conquest, but with commerce. The East India Company arrived on Indian shores in 1600, its royal charter from Queen Elizabeth I granting it a monopoly on English trade with the East Indies. They came seeking spices, textiles, indigo, the luxury goods that European markets craved with an almost insatiable hunger. The Mughal Empire, then at the height of its power under emperors like Akbar and Jahangir, viewed these foreign traders with a mixture of curiosity and disdain. They were granted permission to establish trading posts, factories, as they were called, in coastal cities like Surat, Madras, and later Calcutta. The Mughals saw no threat in these pale-skinned merchants with their strange ships and stranger customs. How could they have imagined that within 2 centuries, the descendants of these supplicants would sit upon the Mughal throne itself? The transformation from trading company to territorial power was gradual, almost imperceptible at first, like the slow turning of seasons. The company's early decades in India were marked by careful diplomacy, by the payment of tribute to local rulers, by the maintenance of a posture of commercial humility. But beneath this surface accommodation, the mechanisms of future dominion were being assembled piece by patient piece. The company began hiring Indian soldiers, sepoys, they were called, to protect its warehouses and trading posts. These small private armies, justified as necessary for the protection of commerce, would become the instrument of conquest. The company established its own courts to adjudicate disputes among European traders, a parallel system of justice that existed alongside indigenous legal traditions. It began collecting revenues directly in areas where local rulers proved unreliable or hostile, transforming merchants into magistrates, traders into tax collectors. The pivotal moment came in 1757 on the muddy plains of Plassey in Bengal. The battle itself was hardly worthy of the name. A brief exchange of cannon fire, some desultory musketry, and then the collapse of the Nawab of Bengal's army, betrayed from within by his own commanders who had been bribed by the company's agents. Robert Clive, the company's military commander, had achieved through treachery what would have required vast armies to accomplish through honest warfare. Bengal, the richest province in India, with its teeming population and abundant revenues, fell into British hands almost by accident. Through a combination of luck, betrayal, and the ruthless opportunism of men who saw in India's political fragmentation a chance for extraordinary profit. But Plassey was merely the beginning. What followed was a systematic expansion, province by province, treaty by treaty, war by war. The company moved like a chess player, exploiting every weakness, every succession dispute, every moment of political uncertainty. When Indian rulers proved pliant, they were maintained as puppet kings, their courts surrounded by British residents who advised on every decision until the advice became indistinguishable from command. When rulers resisted, they were defeated through military force or political intrigue, their territories annexed outright and absorbed into the company's growing dominion. By 1818, with the defeat of the Marathas and the Pindaris, the British had become the paramount power in India. The Mughal emperor still sat on his throne in Delhi, but he was emperor in name only, a pensioner of the company, maintained as a useful fiction, a symbol of continuity that masked the revolutionary reality of foreign domination. The genius of British rule in India lay not in the number of Britons deployed, for their numbers remained always laughably small, but in their ability to make Indians themselves the instruments of empire. This was the great secret, the hidden mechanism that allowed 200 to rule 200 million. The British Indian Army, the steel fist upon which the entire edifice of empire rested, was overwhelmingly Indian in composition. At its height, the army numbered over 2 million men, yet British officers constituted only a tiny fraction of its ranks. Indian sepoys, recruited primarily from specific communities deemed martial races by their British overlords, formed the infantry and cavalry that conquered and held India for Britain. These soldiers were not pressed men, unwilling conscripts dragged to war in chains. Many enlisted voluntarily, drawn by the promise of steady pay, by the prestige of military service, by loyalty to salt, the traditional oath of service that bound Indian soldiers to their employers with bonds stronger than contract. The psychology of this arrangement was profound. The British carefully cultivated loyalties that superseded national or even regional identity. They recruited heavily from Punjab, from the hills of Nepal, from communities with long military traditions, and a culture that valorized martial prowess. They played upon existing rivalries, Hindu against Muslim, high caste against low, one ethnic group against another. Regiments were segregated by religion and caste, creating internal divisions that made unified resistance nearly impossible. Officers learned the languages and customs of their men, not out of genuine respect, but out of calculated pragmatism, understanding that a commander who could speak to his sepoys in their own tongue, who knew their festivals and honored their religious practices, could command a loyalty that transcended mere monetary compensation. This army was deployed not primarily against external enemies, but against internal resistance. When Indian rulers rebelled against company encroachment, it was Indian soldiers who marched against them. When peasants rose in revolt against oppressive taxation, it was Indian troops who suppressed them. The great irony of British India was that Indians policed Indians, that the empire's violence was administered primarily by indigenous hands. The British provided the officers, the strategic direction, the ideological framework, but the actual work of conquest and control was performed by Indians themselves, making British rule not simply an imposition from without, but something far more complex, a system in which Indians were complicit in their own subjugation. Beyond the army lay the bureaucracy, that vast paper machinery through which the daily governance of empire was conducted. The Indian civil service, established in the mid-19th century, was theoretically open to Indians, but examinations were held in London, tested knowledge of classical European languages and literature, and were designed in such a way that few Indians could realistically compete. Those who did manage to enter the service, and their numbers grew slowly over the decades, found themselves operating within a framework entirely designed by and for British interests. The ICS numbered, at its peak, only about 1,000 British officers, yet this tiny cadre administered a subcontinent. How was this possible? Because beneath them operated an enormous machinery of Indian subordinates, clerks, translators, tax collectors, village headmen, minor magistrates, millions of Indians whose daily labor sustained the empire's functioning. These were not collaborators in the simple sense. They were men, and they were almost exclusively men who needed employment, who sought security in an uncertain world, who operated within a system that had made itself appear inevitable. The British were masters of what might be called the bureaucracy of inevitability, creating administrative structures so complex, so apparently rational, so thoroughly documented, that they seem to operate by their own internal logic, independent of the human will that had created them. Revenue systems, legal codes, police procedures, educational curricula, all were standardized, rationalized, reduced to rules and regulations that filled libraries of leather-bound volumes. This was not random or chaotic oppression, but ordered, systematic, bureaucratic control, and its very orderliness gave it a kind of legitimacy in the eyes of many who lived under it. The legal system provided perhaps the most striking example of how British rule functioned through transformation rather than simple imposition. The British did not sweep away Indian legal traditions entirely. Instead, they selectively incorporated elements of Hindu and Islamic law, codifying and systematizing them in ways that fundamentally altered their character. Traditional legal systems in India had been fluid, based on custom and precedent, varying by region and community, administered by local elders or religious scholars who possessed the wisdom to interpret sacred texts and customary practices. The British replaced this flexibility with rigid codes, written in English, administered by courts that followed British procedures of evidence and argument. They created the category of personal law, matters of marriage, inheritance, and religious practice, which would be governed by Hindu or Muslim law as interpreted by British judges, while criminal and commercial matters fell under British-derived codes. This bifurcation was not a respectful preservation of indigenous tradition, but a divide-and-rule strategy that ensured Indians remained fractured by religious identity, even as they were united under British sovereignty. The Indian judges and lawyers who operated within this system found themselves in a peculiar position. To succeed, they had to master English, to think like Englishmen, to internalize the logic of British jurisprudence. Many became, in effect, brown Englishmen, adopting British manners, British dress, British values. They sent their sons to English schools. They aspired to recognition from their colonial masters. They participated enthusiastically in the very system that subordinated their own people. This was not stupidity or moral failure, but a rational response to the incentive structures created by empire. Success meant collaboration, resistance meant exclusion from the only pathways to prosperity and status that the colonial system made available. Education formed another crucial pillar of British control, perhaps the most insidious because it operated directly on minds rather than bodies. Lord Macaulay's infamous Minute on Education in 1835 articulated with unusual clarity the imperial strategy to create a class of persons, Indian in blood and color, but English in taste, in opinions, in morals, and in intellect. The British established schools and colleges that taught in English, that made the mastery of English language and literature the gateway to administrative positions and social advancement. The curriculum deliberately devalued indigenous knowledge systems, the rich traditions of Indian science, mathematics, philosophy, and art, in favor of European learning. Young Indians who passed through these institutions emerged alienated from their own cultures, conditioned to see India through British eyes, to accept as self-evident truths the racial hierarchies and civilizational narratives that justified British rule. Yet this educational project was never complete, never as successful as its architects hoped. It created not a uniformly compliant class of subordinates, but something far more dangerous to empire. A generation of Indians educated enough to understand the principles of liberty, equality, and self-determination that Britain claimed to embody, yet excluded from the full benefits of British citizenship by the color of their skin. These English-educated Indians would become the core of the nationalist movement that would eventually dismantle the empire. But in the 19th century, they remained a minority, their influence limited to urban centers and professional classes, while the vast majority of Indians continued to live in villages where British rule was experienced not through education or legal codes, but through the revenue collectors' demand for taxes. The revenue system, the extraction of wealth from India's agricultural economy, was the material foundation upon which the entire structure of empire rested. Everything else, the army, the bureaucracy, the courts, the railways, the canals, was ultimately funded by taxes drawn from Indian cultivators. The British did not invent taxation in India, of course. Mughal emperors and regional kingdoms had long collected revenue from agriculture. But British revenue extraction was different in both scale and inflexibility. The permanent settlement in Bengal, introduced in 1793, fixed land revenue at a high rate in perpetuity, turning zamindars, traditional revenue collectors, into something resembling landlords with property rights over land they had previously merely administered. This created a new class of large landowners whose interests were tied to British rule, but it also removed traditional flexibility in revenue collection. When harvest failed, when drought or flood destroyed crops, the revenue demand remained unchanged. Cultivators who could not pay lost their land, creating a class of landless laborers and driving millions into desperate poverty. In other regions, the British experimented with different systems: the Ryotwari system that collected taxes directly from cultivators, the Mahawari system that dealt with village communities collectively, but all shared the same fundamental characteristic. Revenue extraction was systematic, inflexible, and oriented toward maximizing collections regardless of local conditions. British administrators compiled vast revenue surveys, mapping every field, recording every crop, creating paper representations of rural India that existed primarily to facilitate taxation. The village became a unit of revenue administration, its traditional social structures subordinated to fiscal imperatives. Headmen who had once mediated between village and state became tax collectors. Their authority derived no longer from community consensus, but from British appointment. The impact on rural India was catastrophic. Famines, which had occurred periodically throughout Indian history, became more frequent and more deadly under British rule. The great famines of the late 19th century, 1876, 1878, 1896, 1897, 1899, 1900, killed millions. These were not natural disasters, but policy-induced catastrophes. British administrators, committed to principles of free market economics, refused to interfere with grain exports even as peasants starved. They provided minimal relief, fearing that aid would create dependency and distort market mechanisms. They continued to collect revenue even from famine-stricken districts, prioritizing the fiscal health of the empire over the lives of its subjects. The death toll from these famines was staggering. Estimates range from 12 to 29 million deaths across the late 19th century. Yet they generated remarkably little controversy in Britain itself. Indian lives simply did not weigh heavily in the moral calculus of empire. The economic relationship between Britain and India was fundamentally extractive. India was transformed into a supplier of raw materials for British industry and a captive market for British manufactured goods. Indian cotton was shipped to Manchester mills, woven into cloth, and sold back to India at prices that destroyed indigenous textile production. India had once been the world's great textile manufacturer, its muslins and calicos prized from Europe to Southeast Asia. Under British rule, textile production collapsed. Millions of weavers and artisans lost their livelihoods, and India became an importer of cloth rather than an exporter. This deindustrialization was not accidental, but the result of deliberate policy: tariffs that protected British textiles while exposing Indian producers to unequal competition, infrastructure investments that facilitated extraction rather than development, a banking system oriented toward financing British trade rather than Indian enterprise. The railways, often celebrated as a British gift to India, exemplify this extractive logic. Yes, Britain built an extensive railway network in India, one of the largest in the world by the early 20th century. But these railways were not built primarily for Indian benefit. They were financed by Indian taxpayers and investors, guaranteed returns that enriched British stockholders, and designed to move goods from interior to coast, from raw material source to export port. They facilitated military deployment, allowing British troops to be moved rapidly to suppress rebellion or unrest. They did create new economic opportunities, yes, but within a framework that ensured Indian subordination to British economic interests. The railways were steel tracks binding India ever more tightly to empire, yet resistance to this system was constant, taking forms both violent and subtle. The Great Rebellion of 1857, which the British called the Sepoy Mutiny, and Indian nationalists later termed the First War of Independence, was the most dramatic explosion of resistance, but it was neither the first nor the last. The rebellion began in May 1857 when sepoys at Meerut refused to use new cartridges rumored to be greased with beef and pork fat, offensive to both Hindu and Muslim religious sensibilities. The mutiny spread rapidly across northern India, drawing support from dispossessed nobility, from peasants oppressed by revenue demands, from communities that had seen their traditional ways of life disrupted by British modernization. For several months, British rule in northern India seemed on the verge of collapse. The rebels captured Delhi, restoring the Mughal Emperor Bahadur Shah Zafar to nominal power, and besieged British garrisons across the region. The rebellion was ultimately suppressed with extraordinary brutality. British and loyal Indian troops, for significant portions of the army, remained loyal to their British commanders, retook Delhi after bitter fighting, massacring thousands of civilians in reprisal. Captured rebels were executed en masse, often blown from cannon in a deliberate inversion of the Mughal punishment for traitors, designed to demonstrate British power and to desecrate bodies in ways particularly horrifying to Hindu and Muslim religious sensibilities. Bahadur Shah Zafar was tried for treason and exiled to Burma, where he died in 1862. The last Mughal emperor reduced to a British prisoner. The rebellion failed, but its impact was profound. It revealed the fragility of British rule, its dependence on Indian acquiescence. It led to the dissolution of the East India Company and the transfer of power directly to the British Crown in 1858. India became formally part of the British Empire, no longer the private domain of a trading company, but a crown colony, governed by a viceroy who represented Queen Victoria herself. The post-1857 period saw both a hardening and a sophistication of British control. The racial barriers between ruler and ruled became more rigid. British officials increasingly lived in separate cantonments, limiting their social contact with Indians to strictly hierarchical relationships of master and servant. The easy intimacy of earlier decades, when company officers often took Indian wives, learned Indian languages fluently, immersed themselves in Indian culture, gave way to a more distant, more rigidly racist imperialism. Indians were systematically excluded from positions of real authority, confined to subordinate roles regardless of their qualifications. The Indian civil service, while theoretically open to Indians, remained overwhelmingly white through a combination of examination procedures designed to favor British candidates and informal discrimination that made the few successful Indian candidates unwelcome in the service's social circles. At the same time, British rule became more bureaucratically sophisticated, more concerned with demonstrating its legitimacy through the provision of certain public goods, railways, telegraphs, irrigation systems, a postal service, modern legal codes. The British presented themselves as agents of progress, bringing civilization to a backward land. They sponsored censuses that cataloged India's population, ethnographic surveys that classified and categorized India's bewildering diversity, archaeological expeditions that uncovered India's ancient past and claimed it as heritage, requiring British preservation. This knowledge project was never neutral. It created categories of caste, religion, ethnicity that had been fluid and contested in pre-colonial India, fixing them into rigid classifications that served administrative convenience and divide-and-rule strategies. The British also cultivated a new Indian elite whose interests were bound up with the continuation of imperial rule. The princes of the princely states, roughly 2/5 of the subcontinent, remained under nominal rule of Indian princes who had accepted British suzerainty, were maintained in luxury, granted honors and titles, educated at special institutions designed to train them in loyal subordination. They were taught to hunt, to play cricket, to behave like English gentlemen, while their states were supervised by British residents who controlled foreign policy and intervened in domestic affairs whenever British interests required. These princes served as a conservative ballast against Indian nationalism, their glittering courts and loyal protestations of devotion to the crown providing a reassuring fiction of consent to British rule. Similarly, the British cultivated large landowners, successful merchants, and Western-educated professionals who benefited from the colonial order and who could be counted upon to oppose revolutionary change. Yet this strategy contained its own contradictions. The very education the British provided, the very legal and political concepts they introduced, created expectations they could not fulfill. Indians educated in British universities returned home expecting to participate as equals in governance, only to find themselves excluded by racism. Indian lawyers practiced in courts that claimed to dispense justice impartially, yet they saw those courts consistently favor British over Indian litigants, commercial interests over peasant rights. Indian soldiers fought bravely in British wars, in Burma, in Afghanistan, and China, and eventually in the trenches of the Western Front during World War I, yet they returned home to find themselves treated as racial inferiors, denied the citizenship rights granted to far less deserving Europeans. The growth of Indian nationalism in the late 19th and early 20th centuries was thus not simply a rejection of foreign rule, but a demanding of the very rights and principles that Britain claimed to embody. The Indian National Congress, founded in 1885, began as a moderate organization that petitioned politely for greater Indian participation in governance. Early Congress leaders were loyal to empire, seeking reform within the imperial framework rather than independence from it. They spoke the language of British liberalism, citing John Stuart Mill and Edmund Burke, asking only that the principles Britain professed be applied to India as they were to Britain itself. But moderate reform was not forthcoming, at least not at a pace that satisfied Indian aspirations. The British conceded small measures, limited local self-government, slightly expanded franchise, a few more Indians in advisory councils, but they retained all real power in British hands. The viceroy and his officials ruled by decree, responsible not to the Indian population, but to London. Indian political life was tightly controlled, with British authorities quick to ban meetings, censor publications, and arrest agitators deemed seditious. The very tools of modern politics that Indians were beginning to master, public meetings, newspapers, voluntary associations, were subjected to constant surveillance and repression. The contradictions of imperial rule became increasingly apparent in the early 20th century. World War I proved a watershed. India contributed enormously to the British war effort. Over 1 million Indian soldiers served overseas, fighting in Mesopotamia, East Africa, and on the Western Front. They died in trenches far from home for a cause that had little direct relevance to India, fighting for an empire that denied them basic rights. The war created expectations of reward for this loyalty, expectations that were brutally disappointed. Instead of political reform, the post-war period brought the Rowlatt Acts, which continued wartime restrictions on civil liberties, and then the Amritsar massacre in April 1919, when British troops under General Reginald Dyer fired on an unarmed crowd celebrating a Sikh festival, killing hundreds in a confined space with no escape routes. Dyer made no apology, declaring he had intended to create a moral effect, to demonstrate that defiance of British authority would be met with maximum force. Amritsar marked a turning point in Indian political consciousness. It revealed with stark clarity the essential nature of British rule, control maintained ultimately through violence, through the willingness to massacre unarmed civilians to preserve order. The moderate politics of petition and reform increasingly gave way to mass mobilization and demands for independence. Mohandas Gandhi emerged as the leader of this transformed nationalism, his tactics of nonviolent resistance, satyagraha, truth force, mobilizing millions of ordinary Indians in campaigns of civil disobedience. Gandhi understood intuitively what many educated Indians had forgotten, that British rule rested not simply on military force, but on Indian acquiescence, on the cooperation of millions who staffed the bureaucracy, who paid the taxes, who accepted British authority as legitimate. Withdraw that cooperation, Gandhi argued, and the empire would collapse regardless of how many soldiers Britain deployed. The interwar period saw a succession of mass movements. The non-cooperation movement of 1920, 1922, the civil disobedience movement of 1930 or 1934, the Quit India movement of 1942, each demonstrating the growing power of Indian nationalism and the weakening grip of British control. The British responded with repression, mass arrests, lathi charges, prohibitions on political meetings, but also with concessions. The Government of India Act of 1935 created provincial autonomy with elected Indian governments. though the viceroy retained ultimate authority and control over defense and foreign affairs. It was too little, too late. The legitimacy of British rule had been fatally undermined. Indians no longer accepted the civilizing mission narrative, no longer believed that British rule was in their interest, no longer feared British power in the way they once had. World War II completed the unraveling. Britain's humiliating defeats in Southeast Asia, the fall of Singapore to Japanese forces, the spectacle of British troops surrendering to an Asian power, shattered the myth of British invincibility. India's economic resources were ruthlessly exploited for the war effort, leading to the Bengal famine of 1943, which killed some 3 million people through a combination of crop failure, wartime inflation, and governmental indifference. Indians saw their food exported while they starved, saw British priorities placed above Indian lives with a clarity that made further loyalty to empire impossible for all but a committed few. By 1945, Britain was exhausted by war, financially ruined, dependent on American aid, no longer capable of maintaining empire by force. The Indian Army, the steel fist that had held India for Britain, was no longer reliable. Indian soldiers who had fought in World War II had seen the world, had been treated as equals by some Allied forces, had witnessed British weakness, and had returned home politically transformed. Mutinies in the Royal Indian Navy in 1946 demonstrated that the military instrument upon which British rule fundamentally rested could no longer be counted upon to suppress Indian resistance. Britain faced a choice: grant independence peacefully or attempt to hold India by force in a struggle that would be bloody, expensive, and probably futile. The decision was made to withdraw, though the British attempted to control the terms and timing of their exit. Independence came in August 1947, accompanied by the partition of India into India and Pakistan, a communal catastrophe that killed hundreds of thousands and displaced millions. The final terrible legacy of divide and rule policies that had fostered communal identities as tools of control. The British left, the last viceroy sailed away, and the Union Jack was lowered for the final time over India. The rule of 200 over 200 million had come to an end. But how had it lasted so long? How had such a numerically absurd dominion functioned for nearly 2 centuries? The answer lies not in simple oppression, though oppression there certainly was, but in a complex system that made Indians themselves the instruments of their own subjugation. The British ruled India with Indian soldiers, Indian bureaucrats, Indian tax collectors, Indian lawyers, Indian princes. They created structures that divided Indians against each other, that rewarded collaboration and punished resistance, that made working within the system appear rational and resistance appear futile. They deployed superior military technology, yes, but more importantly, they deployed superior organizational techniques, the bureaucratic machinery of the modern state, the systematic collection of information, the rationalization of administration, the creation of economic dependencies. They also deployed psychology, understanding that power is as much perception as reality. They cultivated an image of themselves as natural rulers, destined by race and civilization to govern lesser peoples. They encouraged Indians to internalize this racial hierarchy, to accept as natural and inevitable the subordination of brown to white. They used education to create a class that thought like Englishmen, that measured worth by English standards, that aspired to English approval. They used law to create an appearance of justice and rationality while consistently favoring British interests. They used ritual and ceremony, the grand durbars, the honors and titles, the elaborate etiquette of the Raj, to overawe and impress, to make British rule appear magnificent and permanent. Yet this psychological edifice was always fragile, requiring constant maintenance. Every act of British injustice, every famine, every massacre, every broken promise, eroded the legitimacy upon which the system ultimately depended. The 200 could rule 200 million only so long as the 200 million allowed themselves to be ruled, only so long as enough Indians accepted British authority as legitimate or feared the consequences of resistance more than they desired freedom. Once that acceptance crumbled, once fear gave way to anger and then to organized resistance, the entire structure proved remarkably brittle. The empire that had seemed so permanent, so powerful, so inevitable, collapsed within a few years of serious challenge to its legitimacy. The symbolism of empire, the railway tracks that had bound India to British economic interests, the coins that had carried Queen Victoria's image into millions of hands, the flags that had flown over courthouses and cantonments, the rifles that had maintained order, all these material manifestations of power proved surprisingly meaningless once Indians withdrew their consent. The railway tracks remained, became infrastructure for an independent nation. The coins were melted down or became curiosities for collectors. The flags were lowered and burned or relegated to museums. The rifles passed to the hands of Indian soldiers who now served an Indian government. The physical machinery of empire could be repurposed or discarded. What could not be so easily escaped were the structures, legal, bureaucratic, economic, social, that the British had built into Indian society, the ways of thinking they had encouraged, the divisions they had fostered, the dependencies they had created. Independent India inherited a state apparatus designed for extraction and control, not for development and democracy. It inherited religious and caste divisions that had been systematically exploited and rigidified under colonial rule. It inherited an economy oriented towards serving British interests, lacking industrial capacity, dependent on agriculture that had been stagnant or declining for decades. It inherited educational institutions that had trained subordinates rather than citizens, a legal system that had prioritized order over justice, a bureaucracy that had been responsive to foreign rulers rather than local populations. The project of decolonization was thus not simply a matter of lowering one flag and raising another, but of fundamental transformation of structures that reached deep into society. Yet it would be wrong to see the British period as merely negative, as pure destruction and exploitation. The British did build infrastructure, did create administrative institutions, did introduce legal and political concepts that would be resources for Indian nationalism and post-colonial democracy. The Indian National Congress itself was a product of British-introduced political forms. The Indian Constitution, adopted in 1950, drew on British parliamentary traditions even as it rejected colonial subjugation. The Indian Army, the Indian Civil Service, the Indian legal system all showed continuities with colonial institutions, even as they were transformed to serve new purposes. The English language, imposed as a tool of control, became a lingua franca, enabling communication across India's linguistic diversity and a window to global knowledge and culture. History is never simple. The British impact on India cannot be reduced to a simple moral calculus of good versus evil, progress versus regression. It was both exploitative and transformative, destructive and creative, brutal and modernizing. What is undeniable is the audacity of the project, the sheer improbable ambition of 200,000 Europeans at most, usually far fewer, ruling a subcontinent of hundreds of millions, maintaining that rule for 2 centuries, extracting enormous wealth, fighting wars, building railways and canals, administering justice, collecting taxes, managing famines and rebellions, educating and indoctrinating, all while maintaining the fiction that they were governing for India's benefit rather than Britain's. The mathematics of empire remains astounding. 200 senior British officials, supported by perhaps a few thousand more in subordinate positions, governing 200 million Indians. The ratio defies belief until one understands that those 200 were not ruling alone. They were the visible apex of a vast pyramid of power whose base consisted of millions of Indians, soldiers, policemen, clerks, headmen, landlords, princes, lawyers, teachers, all performing the daily work of governance, all making possible the impossible. British rule in India was not simply British rule, but an Indo-British system, a hybrid creation that could not have functioned without extensive Indian participation. This is perhaps the most uncomfortable truth about empire, the one that resists simple narratives of oppressor and oppressed. Empires do not function through sheer force alone. They require collaboration, accommodation, the creation of interests tied to imperial rule, the generation of beliefs that make that rule appear natural or inevitable. The British were extraordinarily skillful at creating such systems, at identifying and cultivating collaborators, at structuring incentives so that working within the imperial system appeared more rational than resisting it. They were aided by India's diversity, its multiple languages, religions, castes, ethnic groups, which made unified resistance difficult and divide and rule strategies effective. They were also aided by India's poverty, by the desperate need for employment and security that made collaboration with empire an economic necessity for many. A clerk's job in a British office, a soldier's position in the British Army, a contract to supply the railway, these were opportunities for survival and modest prosperity in an economy where such opportunities were scarce. To condemn such collaboration is easy in retrospect, comfortable in the certainty of historical judgment. But for individuals living through those decades and centuries, the choices were rarely clear-cut. Resist and face unemployment, imprisonment, or death. Collaborate and feed one's family, educate one's children, perhaps even exercise some limited influence within the system. Most chose collaboration, or at least accommodation, making the daily compromises that allowed empire to function. Yet some resisted, and their resistance, however brutally suppressed, kept alive alternative visions of India, alternative futures beyond empire. The peasant rebellions that erupted periodically throughout British rule, the tribal uprisings in frontier regions, the urban strikes and protests, the intellectual critiques published in newspapers and pamphlets, the armed revolutionary movements that emerged in the early 20th century, all these forms of resistance testified that British rule was never accepted as legitimate by all, that beneath the surface order maintained by army and police lay currents of resentment and desire for freedom that would eventually sweep away the empire. The story of British rule in India is ultimately a story about power, how it is acquired, maintained, and eventually lost. It demonstrates that power is never purely a matter of military force or economic strength, though these certainly matter. Power is also psychological, structural, cultural. It operates through institutions and incentives, through education and ideology, through the daily routines and rituals that make existing arrangements appear natural. The British built a system that operated on all these levels simultaneously: military, economic, bureaucratic, legal, educational, cultural, creating a totality of control that was remarkably resistant to challenge, precisely because it made resistance appear futile and collaboration appear inevitable. Yet systems of power, however sophisticated, are ultimately dependent on belief and acquiescence. When those erode, when enough people withdraw their consent, when alternative visions become imaginable and then organizable, even the most elaborate structures of control can collapse with surprising rapidity. The British Empire in India seemed eternal, seemed rooted in permanent hierarchies of race and civilization, seemed destined to last 1,000 years. It lasted less than 200 and collapsed not primarily because of military defeat, but because Indians stopped believing in British right to rule, stopped fearing British power, started organizing to demand their own independence. The India that emerged from British rule in 1947 was profoundly transformed from the India of 1757. It had been connected by railways and telegraphs, unified administratively in ways it had never been under indigenous rule, given a common legal system and a common language of administration. It had been impoverished, deindustrialized, subordinated to British economic interests. It had been divided, its religious and caste identities rigidified and politicized. It had been educated in Western knowledge, introduced to European political concepts like nationalism, liberty, and democracy. It carried the scars of 2 centuries of exploitation and the paradoxical legacy of institutions and ideas that would enable the construction of democratic modernity. The British legacy in India remains contested, interpreted differently by different communities with different experiences of colonial rule. For some, the British period represents modernization and progress, the introduction of rule of law and democratic institutions. For others, it represents exploitation and humiliation, the systematic impoverishment of a once rich land, the racist subordination of hundreds of millions. Both interpretations contain truth. History is capacious enough to accommodate contradictions, to hold in tension multiple truths that cannot be easily reconciled. What cannot be disputed is the extraordinary nature of the project itself, The audacity of 200 ruling 200 million, the sophistication of the machinery developed to make that rule possible, the complicity it required from millions of Indians, the resistance it generated among other millions, the vast transformation it worked on Indian society and economy. British India was one of history's great experiments in domination, a laboratory for techniques of control that would be studied and imitated by other colonial powers and post-colonial states alike. It demonstrated that empire is built not primarily on soldiers, but on systems, not on force alone, but on the cultivation of collaboration, not on simple oppression, but on the complex manipulation of incentives and identities. Delhi, August 1947. The midnight hour approaches, the moment when India will wake to life and freedom. In Parliament, Jawaharlal Nehru rises to speak. Long years ago, we made a tryst with destiny, and now the time comes when we shall redeem our pledge. At the stroke of the midnight hour, when the world sleeps, India will awake to life and freedom. Outside, crowds gather, celebration mixed with apprehension, for freedom has come at the cost of partition, of communal violence, of millions displaced, and hundreds of thousands dead. The Union Jack is lowered, the tricolor raised. The British depart, leaving behind railways and canals, courthouses and bureaucracies, but also poverty and division, the bitter fruits of 2 centuries of exploitation. The impossible mathematics of empire has finally collapsed. 200 can no longer rule 200 million because 200 million no longer consent to be ruled. The machinery so carefully constructed, the army, the bureaucracy, the legal system, the educational institutions, the economic dependencies, has been captured, transformed, repurposed for new ends. The soldiers now serve India, the bureaucrats answer to Indian ministers, the judges interpret Indian law. The revolution is at once total and incomplete, for the structures remain even as sovereignty changes hands, and the work of decolonization will take generations, is perhaps not complete even today. What endures is the memory, the scars, the lessons. That power, however dominant it appears, is never permanent. That empire, however sophisticated its machinery, ultimately rests on consent that can be withdrawn. That collaboration with oppression, while understandable, makes oppression possible. That resistance, however futile it appears, keeps alive alternatives and hastens the day of liberation. That history is made not by 200 men ruling 200 million, but by 200 million refusing to be ruled. Finding the courage to imagine different futures and the organization to make those futures real. The sun sets on the British Empire in India, not with military defeat, but with a recognition of the inevitable. A peaceful transfer of power born of exhaustion and pragmatism rather than enlightenment or generosity. The longest experiment in colonial rule comes to its conclusion, leaving behind questions that resonate far beyond India, questions about power and resistance, collaboration and complicity, about how systems of domination are constructed and how they fall, about the price paid by those who live under empire, and the possibilities opened when empire ends. The railway tracks remain, rusting slightly now, carrying Indian passengers on Indian trains. The coins have been replaced, bearing new faces, new symbols of sovereignty. The flags are different, the rifles in different hands, but the memory endures, a reminder that the impossible can be made real, that the few can rule the many, but only for as long as the many permit it.